let me just share this too. And it is the book of Lamentations, which is 5 chapters. And traditionally, it's ascribed to the prophet Jeremiah, which is what we're reading on Tuesday mornings, that this is a very important thing for us to be reading right now and thinking about right now, because we're actually studying it on Tuesdays. And the book of Deuteronomy, according to some people, was also written by the same people. And so the themes of reconciliation, of punishment, but hope, accountability, the covenant, all of these kinds of themes that we have in Deuteronomy are also in Lamentations and with Jeremiah and with Deuteronomy. They're in all of them, which is why some people think they were written by the same people, Jeremiah and his circle of people. So here is a little bit of Echa, of Lamentations being chanted. So this is what Echa sounds like. So I'm going to play it, and then I'm also going to share it up on the screen. Let me see. Hold it. Always. Because I had to mute my mic in order to have it play. But again, this is the first book, the first chapter of the book of Lamentations, and it is a very, very difficult book to read. It is if it doesn't it's very, very hard. It is even when people are hearing it, you can hear it as it's chanted. It's a sad chant. It's a dirge, but I mean, it is. I'll show you some of it because again, if you want to go home and you want to, and again, I don't want people to say like, well, I mean, this is one of the worst examples, this is, it's not an easy thing to read. No, it is. So this is the reflections of people as Jerusalem is being destroyed. So it's 5 chapters, and it is very difficult to read. It's one of the few holidays that I personally have been in Israel for, and there are people who go to Jerusalem when they live in Jerusalem or they live in Israel. They go to the wall and they sit by the wall the whole day. So they'll be there for 24, 25 hours, sitting there on a mat, on a blanket, on the ground the entire day. and they don't leave. They pray the whole time. Yeah. Yeah, they'll read the 5 chapters of Eicha tonight. So, and they'll be chanted like that. And I assume that the cantor will be chanting it, and maybe they'll put it up in English. What's interesting about Eicha, again, if you only read Eicha, which of course people only read it usually at Tisha B'Av, you kind of read it out of context, and it's a very, like I said, it's a very hard book to read. Look, most people who read Lamentations and who take part in Tisha B'Av services, they do, that's not the only holiday they celebrate, but it's traditionally the saddest day of the year. So it's not like every day is supposed to be like this. And again, Yom Kippur is a fast, right? It's a tough day, but it's not a sad day. Yom Kippur is not supposed to be inherently a sad day. As a matter of fact, assuming that we achieve teshuvah, it's a very happy day. The fact that we can come close to God and stand in God's presence on Yom Kippur is not something that's inherently sad. It's solemn, it's serious, it's important, but it's not sad. We're not fasting because we're sad on Yom Kippur. We fast because we want to be as holy as possible. We want to be as close to angels as possible. We want to be as less fixated on worldly things as possible. That's not sadness. That's a holy, mystical, ascetic. It's a serious deal, but it's not sad. Tisha B'Av is sad. Tisha B'Av is a national day of mourning. It's a national Kaddish. It's a national yard site. It's a national day of sadness. Now, again, in Israel today, a lot of people are making political comments about what's going on in Israel. I read a lot of articles that were talking about what Tisha B'Av means this year. I understand why people are upset. I understand the discussions, et cetera. It's definitely a more somber time right now in Israel, how Israel is going to move forward. But at the same time, Tisha B'Av has to be seen. And one of the reasons why I take the holiday seriously is because it has to, if you don't understand what Tisha B'Av is, if you don't understand how horrible the destruction of it was, and the next 2,000 years of being homeless and not having control of your future, then everything else that we're debating and discussing is immaterial. The fact that we can have these debates and we are concerned about what happens in Israel, and Israel is having some crucial discussions right now, but how do you not see that the situation that we're in is completely different than it was for our grandparents and great-grandparents and everyone else who's been Jewish for the last 2,000 years? How do you not understand that? So again, I'm not diminishing the seriousness of what's going on here, but it's really, again, focusing on most days. That's all I want to say is the miracle of Israel. So that being said, I also have a hard time being as sad during Tisha B'Av as my ancestors were. That doesn't mean that I'm not sad on Tisha B'Av. I am. But I also understand that for the 9 days before, for the 3 weeks before, for almost every other day, I am not going to put myself in a sad situation for Tisha B'Av, because I also recognize that we don't live in those times anymore. So, and there are Orthodox rabbis who've also said, look, we have to reevaluate what we're going to do in that 3-week period or that 9-day period. Because there's people, for example, that didn't shave for the last 9 days. There's people for the last 9 days wouldn't go into a pool, wouldn't listen to music, wouldn't go to a celebration, wouldn't go to a concert, wouldn't travel, wouldn't do anything during these 9 days. And, look, that's a minority of people. I mean, those are really, really observant people that would have done that. Don't get me wrong. But there are some within the Orthodox community who say, hey, maybe we have to understand that because Israel is being redeveloped and Israel is not the way it was for the last 2,000 years that we have in Israel, that maybe we have to reevaluate what those 9 days or what those 3 weeks ahead of Tisha B'Av look like. And so there is discussion about how to accommodate for a different approach to what Tisha B'Av is. That being said, again, I really do think you have to be sad on Tisha B'Av, because if you're not sad about it, if you don't try to think about it at all, how can you celebrate Israel's existence? Because you can't really appreciate what it was like if you don't try to think about what it was like not to have it, or to suffer through its destruction. And again, to prevent its destruction from ever happening again. So that is definitely the theme for tonight. It's the theme for the next 24 hours, is to think about Jewish sovereignty, to think about what we have, what we've lost, what we don't want to lose again, and to try to think about what it was like for 2,000 years not to have Israel, not to have that ability to know that there's a army that can protect us, or that there's a group of people that if Jewish people are taken hostage like they were, in Uganda, that there's an army now that can come and rescue them, which there wasn't 75 years ago. There was no army that was going to come and save you if you were a Jew being attacked somewhere 75 years ago. So that's what we have to think about. I mean, that's what Tisha B'Av is all about. So I've spent a couple of Tisha B'Avs in Israel. That's pretty moving. I've been there a couple of times for Tisha B'Av, but the most powerful Tisha B'Av I've ever had, at least that gave me the chills and gave me the most powerful experience, was a Tisha B'Av that I had, that I was in Frankfurt, Germany for about 20 something years ago, when I was in Frankfurt for Tisha B'Av, and went to one of the only synagogues that survived Kristallnacht, and being in that synagogue and thinking about the destruction that was there, not 2,000 years ago, but at the time, 70 years ago, and thinking about and reading and hearing those words, and thinking about like people on these streets watching this happen. And that was pretty powerful, because that seemed real to me in a way that it affected me deeply. Man, I walked out of that synagogue, and as much as I tried to keep it together during the service, and I just started crying when I walked out on the street and thought about like this building, that it actually survived. And the only reason why that synagogue survived was because it was connected to another building next door. So any of the freestanding synagogues were destroyed in Germany and Austria, but the ones that were attached to other buildings survived, if they survived the bombings and everything else. But in Frankfurt, it was one of the only synagogues, like, one of the only urban synagogues that survived. It's not the only synagogue in Germany survived. There were other synagogues that survived for various reasons, but one of the only ones in a major city that survived aerial bombardment and Kristallnacht, and then when the Allies bombed, because a lot of Frankfurt was destroyed during the war too. So anyways, it's still emotional for me to think about being there. And I've been in other places for Tisha B'Av, because sometimes I'm traveling, but yeah, tonight we're studying, and very importantly, we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy. But I wanted to show you a little bit about what we traditionally read on Tisha B'Av, and just to finish up with one. As I said, it's not a very long book. It's written in a biblical poem style. You can see the lines are essentially the biblical doublet sounds style, sorry. And so here's, for example, earthen pots, which is an interest in the work of the potter's hands, something that we saw in Jeremiah, right, when we talked about the potters. So you can see that Jeremiah uses some of that language and some of those images. So let's just look at one of the lines from the end of the book. And again, we're not going to go through the whole thing. We will, in our Tuesday morning class, be looking at Lamentations a while from now. I can't tell you when, but it'll come up eventually as we go through the cycle of the Tanakh. We'll get to this book, and So you can see chapter 5 is the end. It ends here. But look at these last lines. Line 20 says, why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew us as the days of old. For truly you've rejected us, bitterly raged against us. But then we finish with verse 21 again. We don't want to end on the sad note, so we end with this line again. Right? So this line, which comes from the book of Lamentations, by far the saddest book of the Bible. There's nothing, I mean, like, there's Lamentations, and then like anything else is way down on the list of sadness. This line is not a sad line. Not only is it not a sad line, every time we close up the ark after we've read Torah, we say these lines. You're nodding, Sheldon, why? Because we sing it, right? As part of Etz Chaim. Ashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Chadesh Yameinu Chadesh Yameinu Keke. That's from the book of Lamentations. And look at that line, which is such a powerful line, right? Renew us as in days of old, right? Renew our days, make us new like we used to feel. It's such a weird and such a ironic and powerful phrase, right? Make us feel like we did when we were newer, like we used to feel. And, we're saying this on a national level, as a nation, right? As a people, but we also say this to some extent as individuals. Make us feel like we used to feel when we felt young, when we felt renewed. So there's definitely that feeling of hashivenu, of nashuva, of return, right? Of teshuva, of return, which is something we definitely think about now in this time, which is one of the reasons why, again, we start this process of return after we close the book on Lamentations. As we finish it, we finish with these words. And renew us as in days of old, kedem. And that's what the word kedem means, right? Tradition, or the way it used to be. But what's interesting is it's that juxtaposition, and it's that kind of like, wait, make us feel new like we felt in old days. Now, again, some people go, well, yeah, you mean make us feel like we're young again. But that's not what it says. I mean, that's the way you could understand it that way, but you could also understand it, renew us, make us feel like we can feel through the ways of our tradition. And let's take these, and the word kedem means tradition, right? It means the way things used to be. And let's make ourselves feel young through the traditions, through the ways of antiquity, through the ways of the ancients, through the ways of those who come before us, through our tradition, which is why, it's why there's a grape juice called kedem, right? They called it kedem because it means tradition. It means the way things used to be. So, yeah.
Something coming up on Sunday.
That's right. That's a good segue for those who are for those who are local. And again, you don't have to see it on Sunday. If you can't be with us on Sunday to see it, if you're able to see it, started this weekend, is Fiddler on the Roof at the Performing Arts Center. Has anyone seen it yet? Because it started last weekend. So I didn't get to see it this last weekend, but we're going on Sunday at 2:00 for the matinee, but it is going on. If you can't go on and it's going with us, it's actually coming up the weekend after. It's also, so if you're local, if you're not in town, then unfortunately you won't be able to see it with us. But if you are, please see it with us. Again, these are the dates coming up when it's going to be. So there's matinees on Saturdays and Sundays. And so, yeah, we're going together for this one right here. So As I mentioned, Tevye is being played by my friend, Reverend Andy Maddock from the Valencia United Methodist Church. I shouldn't have told you that, but you'll recognize him. Those of you who were with us for High Holidays last year, we used their church, and Reverend Andy was back in the sound, doing the soundboard most of the services for us, and so he's a really nice guy and very, very nice. So, yeah, that's what we're saying. This is the Canyon Theater, but it's not at the Canyon Theater. It's a Canyon Theater, but it's at the Performing Arts Center. Yes. So yes, go there when you can. Go there with us. We are also going to be doing a screening of the movie Golda, which starts on August 25th at the Lemley, and we're not going to go August 25th because that's a Friday night, but we're going to do a screening day on one of those days that they're going to screen it. We're going to go see Golda. So it's supposed to be good. One of the great Jewish actresses of all time, Helen Mirren. She's not Jewish. I'm joking. Helen Mirren is playing Golda. Brand new, yeah. I mean, it came out they debuted it at Cannes or somewhere else. I mean, but yeah, no, that was a good one. But yes, no, this is this is going to be good. Did you have a chance to watch Ferdinand? No, I haven't been able to see it yet. It's not, I don't have access to it yet. I want to see Oppenheimer this week, or I'm seeing it Monday. Sorry. So it's a pretty serious thing. It talks a little bit about his Jewish identity, a little bit, from what I understand.
Rabbi, I saw Oppenheimer this past Friday.
What did you think?
It's very good. I did not see it in IMAX, which makes a big difference. I recommend that you see it in IMAX.
I've seen it at the Chinese theater. I'm not seeing it with the Chinese. I'm seeing it at the. I don't even know if it's called the Chinese theater anymore. I probably just said something insensitive. Is it called the Chinese? I don't even know. It's Grauman's. Okay, good. I don't want to say anything. Like, I didn't want to say like I just said something racist or something. But yes, I'm going to the Chinese theater to see it.
Well, I saw it at the Lemley in Newhall.
Good.
On Friday, and be prepared for some surprises. That's all I can tell you about it. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's definitely worth seeing, and probably better in IMAX.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to. Well, thank you. And yeah, so I am looking forward to doing that. I'm doing with my daughter. It's kind of my birthday present. I took one daughter to the Dodger game today, and I'm going with another daughter to the Oppenheimer. So that's good. Yeah, so there you go. So we're going to start reading Deuteronomy, and this is kind of where we left off at the end of chapter 4. We started Deuteronomy last week, and as I mentioned, and I'll just kind of repeat for those who weren't here, Deuteronomy is the telling of the story of the Exodus all the way up to where we are at the end of Numbers, which is about to cross over into the Promised Land, but it's all told from the position of Moses, from Moses's point of view. It's all Moses's words, though it sometimes obviously he's invoking God. He's saying what God said. Other than that, this is all Moses recounting it. So he's talking to the next generation, but he's also to some extent obviously talking to us. According to biblical scholars, the book of Deuteronomy was written maybe 200 years after Exodus and Numbers, which is important from the standpoint of when there are differences between the books. The theory is that people didn't necessarily think that the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy would be read right next to each other, which kind of explains why maybe the contradictions that are between the two books, nobody expected people to flip back and forth like we do. And it's not like they didn't know that we would know it, because there are people to this day, and there were definitely many people in our community who knew the Bible, and at least the Torah, pretty much by heart. And you're going to say, well, how did that happen? Well, first of all, they didn't have other things to remember that were maybe less important. They didn't remember the lyrics to American Pie. I mean, I'm not saying American Pie is not important to know, but it's a very long song. I'm using it as an example. And they knew this song. And why they knew it as a song is because we've chanted the Torah. You just heard Echa being chanted. We can chant the entire Bible. And of course, when you chant it, you remember it in a different way. And when you look at a kid who knows every Taylor Swift song, it's great that they know every Taylor Swift song, but there was a time when most kids could chant much of the Torah, and we learn it in a different way when we sing it, which is why we can remember it years and years later, because it goes into our brain in a different way. We process it in a different way, and we save it in a different way. And so people could chant it. Now, chanting it and then recalling it would at least allow people to say, oh, wait, doesn't in Numbers it say, such and such? Or, for example, in Exodus, where we get a version of the first version of the 10 Commandments, isn't that slightly different than the 10 Commandments as it's read or sung today, as we're going to read it, because we're going to read the 10 Commandments here. Again, there are differences. There are not major differences in the 10 Commandments, but there are some. And people would say, well, it doesn't say the same thing. So traditionally, the rabbis would say, well, we believe that both versions are the versions of God. Elu ve'elu divrei Adonai. They're both the words of God. These and those are the words of God. Today, again, people would say, well, they're written by different authors. Maybe an author had that and changed it a little bit, or there's a scribal error, or there was a conscious decision. The point is that our ancestors didn't worry about this. These were not questions that they asked. And again, I'll point it out when it's relevant, but I'm not going to pick apart every line of Deuteronomy that's different from a line in the book of Numbers or Exodus. Again, if it's important, I'll definitely point it out. If it tells us something, then I'll point it out. But as I mentioned last week too, it does not follow the stories of Numbers and Exodus chronologically. We just read about the battles that Israel had with Sihon and Og, these kings of the Amorites that they took land from. That's the end of the book of Numbers. Now we're going back to the story of getting the 10 Commandments, which is in the book of Exodus. It does not follow chronologically. It is more of a stream of consciousness, of Moses's stream of consciousness, which is why I said it's hard to start and stop it, because it's not like we can say, oh, remember where we are in the journey? It doesn't work like that. It also is kind of a testament to how brilliant the book of Deuteronomy is. And as I said, it always makes it so that when we put it down at the end of the night now, we're like, well, how do you stop here? Because it really doesn't, there's not really adequate ways of saying this is the end of a chapter or this is the end of a thought. There are parts of Deuteronomy that kind of are grouped together where we get to like a series of laws or we get to a series of blessings and curses that are clearly narrative units. But for the most part, just flow. This is Moses talking about this, Moses talking about that. So just where we finished off, we talked about the last thing we read is we read about so here in chapter 3 we talked about this was the part that talked about Reuben and Gadites and Manasseh taking that land, and here we got to again another time where again Moses is telling us that God told him he couldn't go into the land, and he again blames the people for it, which is not exactly the way it says in the book of Numbers. God punished him. Here he kind of blames the people for the fact that he couldn't come in. And now where we're at right now, where we left off, is that God gave us the 10 Commandments. And here it says specifically the 10 Commandments. It does not say that in Exodus. For those who weren't with us in Exodus, for those who forgot what it says in Exodus, nowhere in Exodus does it say God gave us the 10 Commandments. It says God spoke to us at Mount Sinai, gave us a copy of it, which Moses then destroyed. And then he came down with another set that was inscribed. Look at how this story is a little different. Because right here it says, God inscribing them on, it says right here, God declared to you the covenant that we're commanded to observe the commandments, inscribing them on 2 tablets of stone. It does not say that Moses doesn't say, and I took those 2 tablets and I threw them down on the ground because I was angry at your parents. It doesn't say that there, right? So today we're going to read the 10 Commandments. We're going to go back to that. So this is where we're at. Again, there's a thing here that we read last week. Adonai will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few scant of you will be left among the nations. You will serve gods of wood and stone, but you will find God there. Again, this is exactly what we read about in the book of Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah. So I'll pick up where we are, which is at the end of chapter 4. We read this, and here's where we are. So we left off with this. Know therefore this day, and keep in mind that Adonai alone is God. Ve'adata hayom hashavotah. Again, what we say in Aleinu, that God, al haaretz mitachat ein there is no other besides God on heaven above. So observe God's laws and commandments, which I had joined upon you this day. And we read this part too, that I may go well with you and your children, with you and your children after you, that you may long remain in the land that your God Adonai is assigning to you for all time. And then it says, and this is where we're picking up, then Moses set aside 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan. Now, why does it talk about Moses here in the third person? I don't know. Moses could have said that like that. This again is at the end of the book of Numbers. So it's skipped again to the book of Numbers, to which a man who has killed someone could escape. One who unwittingly slew another without having been an enemy in the past. It's not exactly what it said, but essentially, again, it's manslaughter, not premeditated murder. He could flee to one of those cities and live. Bezer in the wilderness in the tableland, belonging to the Reubenites, Remote in Gilead, belonging to the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan, belonging to the Manassites. Again, these are 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan, right? That's in addition to the cities that are on the other side. This is on the Israel side. This is the teaching that Moses set before the Israelites. These are the decrees, the laws, and rules that Moses addressed to the people of Israel after they had left Egypt. Again, this is going back to Exodus chapter 20. Beyond the Jordan, in the valley of Beth Peor, in the land of King Sihon of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, whom Moses and the Israelites defeated after they left Egypt. Now, again, it's going back to these stories of the wars against King Sihon, and I mean, these are so important. They had taken possession of the country and that of King Og of Bashan, the 2 kings of the Amorites, which are on the east side of the Jordan, from Aurora on the banks of the Wadi Arnon, as far as Mount Sion. That is not Sion, not Sion, but Sion, that is Hermon, and also the whole Arava on the east side of the Jordan, as far as the sea of the Arava, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day, study them and observe them faithfully." And again, this is the beginning of chapter 5, but again, it's no different than what we've already heard last week, and we're going to hear it again next chapter. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And this is a very common phrase that we have in the book of Deuteronomy. So we're going to get another Shema Yisrael in a chapter. Today we're going to hear it. But right now in chapter 5, we heard this. Hear, O Israel, and study the laws, right? Study them. Smart them and guard them and keep them, right? This is something that we have heard before already. And we'll hear it over and over again in Deuteronomy. And then we also have this phrase too. Hayom, this day. And we have that over and over again in Deuteronomy. This day. Is it the day that Moses said it to them? Is it the day that Moses said it to them when they first heard the laws? Is it today? The day that we hear it. Our God Adonai made a covenant with us at Horeb, which is again the Deuteronomy name for Mount Sinai. This was the covenant made at Horeb. Now, is it the only place where Mount Sinai is called Horeb? No, but in Deuteronomy, it's going to use that name for the mountain. Do people think that it's two separate mountains? Yes, there are people who think that it was maybe two different mountains. Traditionally, we don't think it's two different mountains. What does it mean? It's a good question, because the word, so some people say that Horeb is a nickname for Mount Sinai. The word Horeb in Hebrew means blade or a knife or a sword. So some people say it's because the mountain looks like a blade going up into the sky. So perhaps it's a nickname, but it also could have been what some people call the mountain, and maybe it was not the same mountain. But it's not really, again, we always say Sinai and Horeb are the names of the same place. And here's what Moses says, or what Deuteronomy at least says. It was not with our ancestors that I made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Hayom, Kulanu Chaim, all of those who are alive. So it's not just the people who are at Mount Sinai. Face to face, Adonai spoke to you on the mountain out of the fire. So the previous line just said, it's not with our ancestors that God made this covenant, but with you. Now, how do we rectify these lines? Because they were written by the same person. We're not going to say these two lines were written by different people, right? This covenant is not with our ancestors, but with you. God spoke to you out of the mountain of fire, which means the 10 commandments, the covenant, is with you. And we understand that to be not just our ancestors who were at Mount Sinai, not just our ancestors who heard the book of Deuteronomy, but with all of us. And that's why we have a tradition that every Jew who ever lived was at Mount Sinai. Every Jew who ever lived was at Mount Sinai. That's what we say. Now, does that apply to people who convert to Judaism? That's an interesting question, because some people say, yes, it does. Because once they convert, they're essentially there at Mount Sinai too. The covenant is with them, and they're a part of the covenant from that moment. Or they were always destined to be part of the Jewish people because they were there. Their soul, their spirit was there. There are other people who say, and this isn't a modern argument, this is in the Talmud. This is 2,000 years old. There's another tradition which says that people who've converted to Judaism, who've taken on the covenant freely and without having been at Mount Sinai, have done something much holier than we've done, because we didn't have a choice. We didn't have a choice. We saw the mountain, we were afraid, we were shocked into it, we were petrified, we were in awe. We saw the sound and lights, and this is what the Talmud says. The people who made a willing decision to convert to Judaism are dear to God because they didn't have to go through that in order to make that decision. And that's what the Talmud said 2,000 years ago. That was a pretty powerful line. I remember us hearing that as a kid, studying the Talmud, and the rabbi telling me, it says, there is no one dearer to God than the convert, because they didn't have to be frightened into it or scared into it, or having to see this demonstration of God's power in order to take on the covenant. They chose it. So it was an interesting phrase to think about. I was like, oh, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that there was that feeling about it. Not that, again, that it was like not as impressive. It's actually more impressive. I never forget that. I never forgot that those words are there. Ein chaviv l'Adonai. There's no one dearer to God or more beloved, because they didn't have to be. So it's like, if you're a parent and your kid listens to you without you having to scream at them, you appreciate it a lot more. I guess. I mean, I think so. Are you sure? I feel that way. Anyways, so face to face, Adonai spoke to you on the mountain out of fire. I stood between Adonai and you at the time to convey Adonai's words to you, for you were afraid of the fire and did not go up on the mountain, saying, and again, here's what he said. Now, here Moses is definitely saying, and it does say in the Exodus that the people were too afraid, but that's the introduction now to the Ten Commandments. And here's where it starts. These are Adonai's words, but it's almost embedded in this. And by the way, you guys were too scared to hear it, so I had to help you. That's what he just said. And here's what it says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, and this is exactly the same as it is in Exodus. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Look what it says here. The Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments, is couched both in the second person masculine singular and in terms of household, the basic social and economic unit. Such a format addresses the Decalogue's provisions to whichever responsible party they apply, most typically the male householder. So this is a little discussion over why the terms are in male terms. But it's understood that this is a brit, that this is a covenant. And as such, it's written in the agreement structure, the covenant structure that we find in the Middle East. And so some people say, well, why is it with a male? And it's clearly not with a male, because it says here that the laws are incumbent on women too. At least the Ten Commandments are. So let's take a look. Is that really a commandment? Probably not. Why? Because the way at least this translator puts it, and again, people do it differently, the colon comes after that, which is, this is the prologue. I'm the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It's not a commandment, it's a statement of fact. The laws start here. And this is a very short one, but it's low. It begins with a low. Do not, you shall not, you shall have no other gods besides me. That's the first commandment, not to have any other gods. Now, so again, some people put this line as all one line. Is that what yours has there in the King James, Mary? Or do you have two lines? Two lines? What about yours? Let's see. Glory's first. Yeah, do they put it together as one line, or do they put it together as? But do they have, you shall have no other gods besides me, starting a new line?
That is just one line.
And they have a colon ending after the house of bondage?
Sorry, because I've been watching them down.
No, it's okay. For verse 6, do they have it ending with a colon or a period?
I am God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery.
And then a period or a colon?
Period.
So that might be because, and they have 7 separate and 8. Do they have 8 separate from 7?
Shall not make for yourself.
Yeah, they have that as a separate one. Okay. Okay, it is 8, but they didn't put it on together with the same line above it. Because sometimes they'll have one by itself as I'm the Lord God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, which is not a commandment, but then we'll have, you shall have no other gods besides me, and then you shall not make for yourself a sculptured image. Because if you end this in a period, it's like, it's not part of the 10 Commandments. If you put it as a colon with a colon, that implies that that's the prologue that then leads into the 10 Commandments that follow. Again, it's not a big difference, but the punctuation sometimes is a translational choice. That's all I'm telling you. So, second commandment, at least the way we have it here, you shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below the earth. Okay. This is actually part of the same line or the same commandment. You shall not bow to them or serve them, for I, your God, Adonai, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children and upon the third and fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Is that pretty close to the translation, Mary and Glory, you guys have? No, I'm just curious if that's, and it's laid out like that, or do they, well, I guess in the King James, they just laid it out with yeah. So that's the way people would normally do it, because this one has a comma, because they know that, like most of us would not separate, even though it's separated as a verse, they would put 8, 9, and 10 as part of one commandment. Yeah. So that's the law against prohibiting idol worship, right? So the first one is against polytheism, against having more than one God. And then this one is specifically against creating idols. So now the third commandment is, you shall not swear falsely by the name of God, your God Adonai, for Adonai will not clear one who swears falsely by God's name. Now, again, so far, it is identical to what we have in Exodus. Okay? Identical. I know, you already know. Sheldon already knows. Line 12. Line 12. So that's line 3, not taking God's name in vain. Specifically seems to be not so much about saying God's name, though we don't say God's name, and some people don't write God's name and they put G-D and everything else from that commandment. But it really does seem to me swearing by God. Not so much, again, swearing using God's name, though people would say that's included in it, but making a promise and saying, by God, I will do something. You don't do that. You don't invoke God in your promise. Again, people would say by extension, to guard God's name in all forms. Okay, now we get to the fourth commandment, which is Shabbat. Now here we got a little difference, little tiny difference, right? So here we have Shamor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as your God Adonai has commanded you. And why is that different, Sheldon? Yes, because if we look at it, Exodus chapter 20, it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho. Remember the Sabbath day. Yeah, and keep it holy. So here's the problem. It says it differently, right? Observe the Sabbath day or remember the Sabbath day. Well, which is it? Which is it? So we have a difference here. We like both. Joyce likes both. So did our ancestors, because we can't pick. How do you pick between those two? They're great. Sometimes we say we're Shomer Shabbos, right? We keep Shabbat, guard Shabbat. And sometimes we say we remember Shabbat. It's very important to remember Shabbat. How else can you guard it unless you remember it, unless you honor it? And we use the word Zachor, not just to remember it, but to remember it and to honor it and to remember it. So when we say Yizkor, right? It's not just remembering your ancestor, your family member, your loved one. Yizkor means to honor, bless you. It means to honor them and to cherish them. It doesn't mean, oh, I remembered them, right? And on Shabbat, we say at the Kiddush, bless you. We say Zikaron, Yom HaShabbat. We say Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. We remember these things. Now, how do we rectify this? Again, the tradition is that God said both words simultaneously. They were taken down differently in the two sources. You okay? Okay. So we say Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. And how do you all know that? Because it's in Lechadodi. Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. Hishmianu el hamyuchad. Shamor and Zachor were said b'dibur echad, in one word. Some people heard Shamor and some people heard Zachor. They were both there. So that's how we rectify it, is that God actually said something But some people heard one way and some people heard the other way, but they both are legitimate. They're both there. They were both there. We don't pick one. We say they're both there. Shamor v'zachor. So here it says, observe the Sabbath day and holy, but after that, it's the same thing, kind of. Well, actually, let's take a look. Here's Zachor Yom HaShabbat Lakodsho. So there it just says, Lakodsho. It ends there. Here it says, Lakodsho. And then here it adds, Kasher Tzivcha Adonai Elohecha, as God has commanded you. That's a little different too. Is it vastly different? No. Does it change our understanding of the Ten Commandments? No. But it's slightly different. It doesn't just come down to one word, is what I'm trying to say. But then this part's pretty much the same. Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod. 6 days you shall work and shall labor, do your work, and do all your work. But on the seventh day, it's a Sabbath of your God, Adonai. You shall not do any work, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox, your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and your God, Adonai, freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, your God, Adonai, has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. And it definitely uses the word Zachor in here too. Remember that you were a slave. So it's not like the word remember it is not in part of this one, but it's just not as prominent in there. And again, it's very clear that the Sabbath is for you, your son, your daughter, any of the people in your house that are male or female. Everybody is supposed to keep Shabbat. And we remember it because we were slaves in Egypt. All right. That's an important concept, that part of being a free person is being able to rest on the seventh day. Okay. And if you think about it, it reminds us that our freedom is something that we celebrate every Shabbat. Now, I will tell you, if we look back at Exodus, we keep Sabbath because in 6 days Adonai made the heaven and sea and all that was in them, and God rested on the seventh day. So the concept of resting there is reaffirmed or is buttressed by the idea that God rested on the seventh day. In Exodus, that's what it says. In Deuteronomy, it says you do it because God freed you out of Egypt. Now, it says in the Exodus version, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, asher chotzetecha be'eretz Mitzrayim, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It's not like it wasn't in the mind of the person who was recounting or the God's version of the Ten Commandments there. The Exodus is there, but here in Deuteronomy, it's actually given as the reason we remember Shabbat. So why do we do it? Do we do it because of creation or we do it because of the Exodus? Well, we remember both. Because when we do the long Kiddush, we say, Zikaron Ma'aseh Breshit, for the remembering of the creation, and Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. We say it for both. So when we do a Kiddush, we think about Exodus and we think about creation. We think about the universal message of Shabbat, which is that God rested on Shabbat from creation, and God created everything and every person. So there's a universal message for Shabbat, and there's also a particular meaning for us as Jews, because it's a day that we also remember our Exodus and the fact that we were slaves and now we're free. And now we have the ability to be free, and we exercise that freedom by not working on Shabbat. What greater statement of freedom is there than to say, I don't have to work today? So that's what we get from this version of it. So it's slightly different. It's not just the Zecher versus Zachor v'Shamor. It's not just that. It's also this idea of why, to some extent, we do it, which both of them are in the Torah. Both of them are then rephrased in the Kiddush. We think about both of them every Shabbat. We think about creation and we think about our Exodus, the universal and the particular. And that goes for almost every Jewish day. There's a universal element to it and also a particularly Jewish element. This commandment, commandment 5, is exactly as we have from Exodus. Honor your father and your mother as your God commanded you, that you may long endure and that you may fare well in the land that your God is assigning you. Okay? There is one addition, which is the same addition that we had in Shabbat, which is in Exodus. It simply says, honor your father that you may long endure on the land that your God is assigning you. And again, in Deuteronomy, it says, and I'm only showing you this because I want you to see that it's typical for Deuteronomy as God commanded you. That's the part that's added, right? Which is the same phrase that we had here, which is remember the Sabbath day, as God has commanded you. So there seems to be this idea to some extent that when the 10 Commandments are repeated here, that Moses says a couple times, remember God commanded you. So it's almost like you know this because you already heard it. And that's why that phrase to some extent is here. Because you already heard it. I mean, you could already make that argument. That's why that phrase is here. But it is different. And it is, again, something that's the difference between Deuteronomy and Exodus. And again, I'm not going to point them all out, but when they show you something, I will. Now we get to these, which are exactly the same. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Right? So that's, as we go through it, that's 6, 7, 8, those commandments. And then you shall not bear false witness, the 9th. And then here we get to the 10th, which is, and you notice here it says, you men. It doesn't actually say men, but the translator here wants to remind you that the reason that it says this is that generally the laws were given to men, which is why it says, do not covet your neighbor's wife. Likewise, none of you shall crave your neighbor's house or field or male or female slave or ox or ass or anything that is your neighbor's. And that's the end of the 10 Commandments. We'll look at the next line and it'll show you the end of the 10 Commandments. But if this is the end of the 10 Commandments, and again, this is the end of the covenant, which, as I said last week, I'll repeat it again for you today, is something special. Are all the commandments, are every law in the Torah special? Absolutely. But was there maybe an understanding that the 10 Commandments were a brit or a covenant? You keep these 10 laws and I will take care of you. It seems like that was the issue. And it seems like it very much so by what we're going to read in Deuteronomy right now. What we're going to read today as a unit. What you'll see today is this idea that the Jewish people have an agreement. You keep the 10 Commandments and I'll keep you in the land. There's a hint to it in the 10 Commandments themselves. Honor your father and your mother that you may long endure and that you may fare well in the land that God is assigning you. It says right in the midst of the 10 Commandments, this is the way you're going to stay on this land. Okay, so we always, whenever we read the 10 Commandments and we get to the 10th commandment, which is this one, you shall not covet. People say every time, well, I don't say it every time because we've discussed it many times, but to put it out there so that people at least can put this into some perspective. How can the Torah legislate? How can the 10 Commandments include a commandment against something that you think about and not something that you do? In Judaism, we understand that you're only responsible for things you do, not for the things that you think. We're not responsible for every thought that goes in our head, through our head. It's a very comforting thought. Well, that's, yeah, well, that's not what Jimmy Carter said, right? He said, I committed adultery many times in my heart. So anyways, but yeah, he didn't apply Jewish tradition to it, but I understand it's not in our Bible. It's not, it's in the Christian Bible. It's in chapter 5. I know, but what we look at in the stories of, and yeah, and that's why as a Baptist, as a lay preacher, he could say that Judaism tends to frown on the idea that we're responsible for thoughts in our head. So how could this one be there? And we've mentioned it before. And so we're going to mention it again, just so people are comforted. Maybe you don't need this comfort. Maybe you're fine with the law as it exists, but we put it into perspective, which is what this law is about is not about you wanting what your neighbor has, because all of us can have a desire to have something that our friend or neighbor or relative has, right? If our friend gets a new car, gets a Tesla, there's nothing wrong with us saying, you know what, I want a Tesla too. There's nothing wrong when somebody we like earns a lot of money or buys stock or buys a house that's really nice and wins. There's nothing wrong with wanting something that, again, somebody has, if you can have a version of that. What we understand this to be is wanting the exact thing that they have and only wanting what they have. So coveting, the difference between wanting to be married is because your neighbor's married, because your friend got married. That's normal. That's fine. But saying, I have to be married to his wife, that's a problem. That's not good. That's not okay. I need to have his wife and no other woman. That's a problem. And that's what the Torah is talking about. It's talking about wanting to have that exact thing. Not a thing, but that thing. That person, that item. That's where the problem is. If your fixation is only on that one thing, then we got a problem. You've got a problem. So that's why we have that law. Coveting is not about simply wanting something. It's desiring that thing in particular. So, and of course, as we know, when the Israelites finally broke this last commandment, God's done with it. And the person who was responsible for this did it on a national level. He wasn't just, hey, this guy happened to, take away someone's wife. That probably happened every year. It did. But when King Ahab and Queen Jezebel stole Naboth's vineyard, because he wanted that vineyard in particular, and remember, what they also did is they lied. They had people lie in court and say that this guy had spoken up against the king. Read about this in the book of Kings. That was on national level. That was national corruption. It involved the murder of an innocent man, his taking away of his property. Everybody knew about it. And at that point, that's a national issue. Adultery, that's a problem. Does it bring down civilizations? Not unless it's being practiced on a national level. It can. But if it's being practiced by someone in a national office or a national responsibility. And what's the example we have of that? King David. Everybody knew about it. Everybody knew that David and Bathsheba resulted in an innocent man named Uriah being killed. Everybody knew about it. It was a national tragedy. Does that happen? It can. It can. It doesn't happen so much today, but we spent a lot of time dealing with Bill Clinton's infidelity. We spent a lot of time dealing with Donald Trump's infidelities. Has it risen to a national catastrophe? No, but we spent a lot of time on it. Spent a lot of money on it. You've read a lot about it. We spent a lot of our national time on it. We got an impeachment hearing over it. So it can rise to a national catastrophe. According to the Greeks, there was a war fought over Helen of Troy that killed thousands of people. There were other times in history where wars were fought over marriages and infidelities and, humiliations that were caused by a marriage gone awry or a marriage covenant, a marriage arrangement being broken, and people died. Innocent people, went off and fought battles over these things. So yeah, people do get killed over these things. And in Israel, it became a national catastrophe to some extent when King David on a national level not only committed adultery, but ended up sending out one of his field generals to be killed. Because if a king can do that, and a king who is beloved can do that, then anything can happen. So that is the theory we've talked about. One of my professors, David Noel Friedman, wrote that when the people broke all these commandments, people said, it's over, we're done. And at the end of every book of the Bible, up until through the book of Kings, the people break every one of these laws. And it goes in order almost exactly. What? Almost in order, almost a little variation. And he kind of explains why that is in his book, The Unity of the Hebrew Bible. It's a very short book if you want to read it. But the book of Kings is Ahab. The book of Samuel is the book of is commandment 8, adultery, which is a little out of order because as you can see, adultery is actually 7. But anyways, the point is that they're broken almost virtually in order, including, by the way, the very first 2 commandments that are broken in the book of Exodus themselves, which is the golden calf. So he goes through and again, as we break every single one of them, we get eventually the exile, which is what we read about in Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. So if we understand it that way, there's a unity to it, there's a structure to it. Adonai spoke those words, and those and no more to your whole congregation at the mountain, with a mighty voice out of the fire and the dense clouds. God inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, and he gave them to me. So there's Moses's version of getting that. When you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, you came up to me, all your tribal leaders, heads and elders, all the leaders, right? And said, our God Adonai has just shown us a majestic presence, and we have heard God's voice out of the fire. And we have seen this day that humankind may live, though addressed by God. Let us not die, for this fearsome fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of God Adonai any longer, we shall die. And so they said to Moses, and essentially this is what happens in Exodus, they say, we can't take anymore. For what mortal had ever heard the voice of the living God speak out of the fire as we did and lived? You go closer and hear all that our God says, Adonai says. And then you tell us everything that our God Adonai tells you, and we will willingly do it. And Adonai heard that plea that you made to me, and Adonai said to me, I have heard the plea that this people made to you. They did speak well thus. Yes, but they also don't want to hear anything more from God, which means that there was more to come. There was more than the 10 commandments, but these are the 10 commandments. May they be always of such mind to revere me and follow all my commandments, that may go well with them and with their children forever. Go say to them, return to your tents, but you remain with me, and I will give you the whole instruction, the laws and the rules that you shall impart to them, for them to observe in the land that I'm going to give them to possess. So that means there's other laws to follow, right?
Yes.
They have to follow other laws. Be careful then to do as your God Adonai has commanded you. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Follow only the path that your God Adonai has enjoined upon you, so that you may thrive and that so it may go well with you and that you may long endure in the land you possess. Again, the phrase over and over again, that you may live long in the land that you are to possess. Now, If the people didn't hear any more of this, that means that they're hearing it through Moses. Again, the Bible says that essentially in Exodus. That's not really different. But what it takes up here in Deuteronomy is this idea that what you're going to hear now is the rest of what God said. And again, you have to follow it because it was your decision not to hear it. So when I tell you that this is what God said, you could have heard it. You didn't want to hear it. You couldn't take it. And so you asked me to tell it to you. So I will tell it to you. So whenever Moses is speaking, then essentially from then on, in the name of God, they have to say, and we could have heard this, we didn't want to hear it, and now we have to take it the same as we took the commandments. These are what God's told us. And this is what it says. And this is the instruction, the laws and rules that your God Adonai has commanded me to impart to you, to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and to occupy, so that you, your children, and your children's children may revere your God Adonai and follow as long as you live all the divine laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure. Again, long endure in the land, right? It's not that you it's not that you get to live a long life if you follow the laws. It's not that good things will happen to you personally if you keep the laws. But you have to remember what Deuteronomy is telling us, and what to some extent is the concept of why we follow the laws in the Torah is not for our own benefit. There is not necessarily a reward for us individually for keeping the laws. The laws are for society and for the people to be able to maintain their stability and their autonomy in the land that they are going to live. It's not so that I got a really long life and good things happen to me all the way along, along my life. But why did I do all these good things? I didn't get a good life. I didn't get what I wanted. I didn't have the things that I wanted. Life wasn't easy for me. The book of Deuteronomy never says, the Torah doesn't really say it, but Deuteronomy effectively says it's so that society can stay together. These laws are not for, there's not a reward for you that you've checked off the laws and now you get to live a long time. Well, this whole concept that people have of, well, I keep these laws so that, I'll be okay. That's not really what it says. And not only that, Deuteronomy tells us that this is intergenerational, because it's not just you, it's so that your family, your children, and your children's children, this isn't even one generation. This is intergenerational, that you will be able to endure and stay together as a people. So again, people don't really like to hear this, but at least from the Jewish standpoint, we're not guaranteed anything out of our righteousness and our righteous behavior that it's going to translate to anything that we get. I hate to tell you that, but it don't work like that. We don't go, oh, well, I kept Shabbos every week. I'm sure, we're going to win the lottery. It doesn't work that way. There's not even, I kept Shabbos every week. I kept kosher. I did all the holidays. Surely I'm going to be healthy and I'm going to live and my family will be healthy. I wouldn't say that. And keep the laws, because if you don't, society is going to fall apart. Your country will not be able to survive. That's why you do it. You have a national, communal responsibility to everyone else to follow these laws. If you don't, it all falls apart. Obey, O Israel, Shema, the Shamata Yisrael, again the word Shema. Obey Israel, hear, O Israel, willingly and faithfully, that it may go well with you and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as Adonai, the God of your ancestors, spoke to you. Folks, Shema, listen. It's not so that you get a personal reward. but that you can live in this land flowing with milk and honey. Right? That's what it says. It doesn't say for you individually. It's just for everybody. No. How do we translate this? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai. Well, here's the traditional Jewish translation. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai alone. Now, we consider this the watchword of our faith, the first words we're supposed to say when we wake up, when we go down at night, and the last breath we have of life, we're supposed to say this. Now, how did that happen? How did these words in particular? Now, I just showed you the line right above says Shema Yisrael. You just saw it a chapter ago, Shema Yisrael. But this Shema Yisrael is what hits us. It's not unique in the sense that the words here are not already have not been said. I showed you last week. It said Adonai Echad Ein Od. There is none else. It's pretty specific, even maybe more specific than that. But this is the word, these are the lines that these 6 words are so powerful that we say them every day. We put them in a mezuzah. We put them on our, between our eyes and on our arms as tefillin. Why these words in particular? So we don't usually read it in context of the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, but we are now. It's again, just after we just read the 10 Commandments. Just after we hear that these are the laws and the instructions that God, it's part of this whole text. I mean, it's verse 4. It's in the middle of the Parsha. It's not like the beginning of a chapter. It's not the way like God said at Mount Sinai, Shema Yisrael. It doesn't say that. Yet these words are the words. Let's look at context and then we'll go back and maybe you'll have a thought about that or two. So then it says, we've already heard this phrase, with all your heart, with all your soul. Now it adds the word with all your might. You shall love your God Adonai with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions, which I charge you this day. You've heard that phrase before. You heard it today. Hayom, al levavecha, take them to your heart. Impress them upon your children. We just read to your children and your children's children in the verse right above. Recite them when you stay at home and when you're on your way, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. And that's the part that we normally finish with, right? And we add, the other paragraph, which is where we get the Laman Tizkaru. That's actually a section from Numbers. Yes, and it's not the next paragraph, and it's not even from the book. That's from the book of Numbers. It's from chapter 15. It talks about the talus and the fringes, that we will look at them and remember them. So that's another out of context text, but this is the way this part ends, right? And inscribed on the doorposts of your homes. Now, so when we look at these verses, right? And again, it's 5 or 6 verses, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, 9, sorry. Yes, those are verses. We understand, or at least the way we practice this, we actually take these words, the Shema, and we inscribe them on the doorposts of our homes and our gates. Because it says, you shall take to heart these instructions which I teach. But that's like a circular argument, because we're putting these words which I command you this day, but it's not those aren't the words, right? what are they supposed to be putting on them? We believe today, and maybe you feel that way because we just read it in context, that when it says, take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day, that it's right here. The Ten Commandments. Now I'm telling you something you may never have thought about, or you may never have known, that these two chapters are right next to each other. These commandments, which are laid out as the words of God, in the next chapter, it essentially says, take to heart these words which I command you this day. Maybe what was originally in a mezuzah, what was originally in the tefillin, and actually maybe not in a scroll, but maybe on the doorposts of a person's house, were the Ten Commandments. Which is why when people in this country primarily are saying, well, let's put the Ten Commandments up in a civil area, which, you know, gets people upset. Some people upset. It gets people upset. It actually is following this tradition, and they know that. Which is, it seems as though the Torah is actually telling us to do that. The Torah is actually telling us to put the Ten Commandments up all around us to remember the covenant. Why don't we do it anymore? Why did you not even know that? Well, partly because the covenant was already broken. And once the covenant was broken, the idea that remembering the covenant as being only those Ten Commandments maybe became less important. And again, I know you're going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense because we didn't stop keeping the law. Yes, not only did we not stop keeping the law, we actually said, well, maybe we're not supposed to keep the Ten Commandments, we're supposed to keep the whole Torah. There's 613 commandments. Why are these 10 commandments more important than any of the other 613 or 603? And so the rabbis said exactly that. We don't reduce our covenant down to those 10 commandments. It's all the rest of the commandments that God also gave to Moses. The rest of the ones that we didn't hear. The rest of the ones that Moses said, oh, I heard them and I'll tell you them. It's the rest of the Torah. And to some extent, the Talmud, the Jewish codes, and everything else. And so the covenant is not going to be 10 commandments. The law is not 10 commandments. And so the rabbis actually made this decision to not emphasize the 10 commandments by themselves. And so at least within the Jewish community, the 10 commandments stopped being talked about as being that important. Because if we only are following the 10 commandments, then what about the rest of the stuff? Is the rest of the stuff not important? Is the rest of the stuff we're not held accountable for? And so eventually the rabbis will say flat out in the Talmud, we don't know what the most important commandments are. We don't know that keeping the 10 commandments are more important than those 10 commandments are more important than every other commandment that's in the Torah. They say, we don't know what the most important commandment is. God doesn't tell us, well, you only have to keep these 10, or this is the most important commandment. Or if you keep this commandment, you know, you're okay as long as you keep this one. The Torah never says keep the 10 commandments, and as long as you keep those 10, I won't hold you as accountable for the other ones. It doesn't say that. And so the rabbi said, look, we don't know, and we are not going to focus on those. There's a tradition that every day the Jewish people would have said the 10 commandments. They would have repeated it. They would have seen it on their doorposts. They would have seen it maybe on a scroll or on an amulet or something that they would have worn on their hearts or worn on their arms. They would have had the 10 commandments around them all the time. We don't know. But we do know that the rabbi said, that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to focus on 10 commandments. So, that's why we don't focus on the 10 commandments. So, any thoughts on that? Any?
They are on some of our important buildings in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I mean, people have, obviously they've taken the 10 commandments to heart in different ways, but we as Jews generally say we don't have 10 commandments to follow. We have 613 commandments. Nobody ever says, hey, do you follow the 10 commandments? No Jew ever says that. Look, there are Christians who felt that the 10 commandments, like maybe Jesus made it so we don't have to follow all the commandments, but we got to at least follow the 10 commandments. We call those people Seventh-day Adventists. That's why they keep Shabbat. They didn't keep Shabbat because we like Shabbat. They kept Shabbat because it's in the 10 commandments. They said, God still wants us to keep the 10 commandments. Jesus did not abrogate the 10 commandments. The sacrifice that Jesus made did not take away the 10 commandments. But they felt you still had to follow the 10 commandments, including Shabbat. It wasn't like they picked Shabbat out as the one commandment to follow. They're following the 10 commandments. Look, most Christians would say, hey, the 10 commandments are pretty good, but you're not going to say, well, Shabbat, we don't have to keep anymore. So the Seventh-day Adventists said no. It definitely seems like the Jews had that idea even by the time that Deuteronomy, to some extent, is writing this. Because this is opening up. Everything else that we have after this is also important. Why? Because it says right here, when your God Adonai brings you into the land that was sworn to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to be assigned to you, great and flourishing cities that you did not build, houses full of good things that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you eat your fill. Take heed not to forget Adonai, who freed you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Revere only your God Adonai and worship God alone, and swear only by God's name. Do not follow other gods, any gods of the peoples about you. Now, all of a sudden, we're getting into, now again, you could say so far, this is all the same things that we read in the 10 Commandments. But trust me, what follows in the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, and even though we're going to finish in 10, 15 minutes, trust me when I tell you, when we finish here today, you're not going to know where the law ends, because it doesn't end. It doesn't end until we get all the way to chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. It will be for the next 20 chapters unclear where this actually ends, because most of the laws in the Torah, and I said this last week, so I apologize if I'm being redundant, most of the laws in the Torah are in the book of Deuteronomy. Most of the laws are in the book of Deuteronomy. One chapter, one parsha alone, Kitetse has 72 mitzvot. 72. So what is the book of Deuteronomy if nothing but a law code that the people are supposed to follow beyond the 10 commandments? So, yes.
When they took the house that wasn't theirs and the field that wasn't theirs, they were actually setting aside another people to, and God.
You know who those people were? The Canaanites. And God told them, and we'll hear it very specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, God said, these people are done. I'm kicking these people out and you're taking their land. And that's what the Torah says. The Torah says that these properties are your properties now. If you don't want to hear that, I'm sorry, but I'm going to tell you ahead of time. The Torah makes no bones. It has no squeamishness about telling you that you're supposed to wipe these people out and take all the stuff that they leave behind. We didn't, and that is true. We didn't do that. Did we not do that because we were squeamish ourselves about it? Did we not do that because we couldn't do it? Because we couldn't physically do it? What?
How do you realize that and do it to somebody else?
So the assumption, I promise you when we get to it, you'll see it, it's very is that these people were so bad that God said, I'm taking them out. Now, the Torah itself essentially says that we were given the land and we were not given the land. This is the weird thing that the Torah actually, I'm going to show you where it says it. You just saw part of it already. God promised it to our ancestors. The book of Deuteronomy doesn't deny that. But when people say, why did God not give it to us then? Look, the easy answer is there weren't enough of us. It wasn't until we went to Egypt and became a great people, a big people, that we could now come and have enough people to settle the land. That's an easy answer. That's not the answer that the Torah itself actually gives. The Torah will say here in the book of Deuteronomy that it's because these people had now earned the point in time where they need to be punished by us. And we're God's agent of destruction. So God does two things. God fulfills the promise for our ancestors, but also punishes these people so that they are driven out because they are so abhorrent and they're so bad. Now, you could say, that sounds horrible. I know what you're going to say. So yeah, it's genocidal and everything else like that. Part of the reason why it exists in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, come Tuesday morning and you'll see exactly why. Because God and Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and all of these things are telling you the same thing will happen to you. And when King Nebuchadnezzar comes and does it to you, it's because God has said now the time has come for you to be kicked out. So understand that the punishment to the Canaanites works to some extent as an object lesson for you. That the same thing that happened to them is now going to happen to you. And this is the way things work. So, yeah, when Jeremiah says it, he says it knowing that everyone had heard these words repeatedly in the book of Deuteronomy. And again, maybe written by the same people who are teaching us the punishment is collective. The laws are collective. They're for everybody, and they're meant to be kept by everybody, and they're meant so that everyone survives collectively. And the punishment, if you don't do it, is also collective. One person's not going to be punished. The king's not going to be punished. The army's not going to be punished. Everyone's going to be punished. And you're going to wind up just like the Canaanites.
They just read over and over, do this.
Read it right here. Do not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples about you. For your God Adonai in your midst is an impassioned God, a zealous God, a jealous God. Glory, I bet your translation says a jealous God. Lest the anger of your God blaze forth against you, wiping you off the face of the earth. The Torah is not squeamish about it because it's saying it's going to happen to you if you do the same thing that they did. Do not try your God Adonai as you did at Massah. That's the story again from the book of Numbers that we saw, Exodus and Numbers, the story of how we tested God, right? Be sure to keep the commandments, the decrees, and the laws that your God Adonai has enjoined upon you. Do what is right and good in the sight of God, that it may go well with you and that you may be able to possess the good land that your God Adonai promised on oath to your fathers, and that your enemies may be driven out before you, as Adonai has spoken. So again, you keep the laws, you're going to get the land that I promised you. And if you don't follow it, you're going to be destroyed. It says it right there in those lines. And here's this law, or this tradition. When in time your children ask you, what are these decrees, these laws and rules that God Adonai has enjoined upon you? You shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Adonai wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and his household. And God freed us from there in order to take us and give us this land that God had promised on oath to our fathers. Then Adonai commanded us to observe these laws, to revere our God Adonai for our lasting good and for our survival, as is now is the case. This is what you're supposed to say to your children. When your children ask you, what are these decrees and laws and rules? When do we say this? At Seder. And when do we specifically say this? Exactly. See? Glory knew. And I guarantee it wasn't in her Bible. Glory knew. It's the 4 children. This is one of the 4 times that the Bible says your children will come and ask you. And so the Torah says it 4 times, and the rabbis derive from that because there's 4 different kinds of children, but this is one of them. in the book of Deuteronomy. But as you can see, it follows the tradition of Deuteronomy, the language of Deuteronomy that says over and over again, your children. The next generation has to learn this. I mean, it's pretty clear. So again, we remember the Exodus and we keep these laws for our survival so that we can stay on a lasting and good land. Not so that good things happen to us, not so that God rewards us with a bountiful harvest for me and for our family because we kept the laws and our next door neighbor didn't. Nah, it's not the case. If the next door neighbor and the neighbor next door are not keeping the laws, it doesn't matter whether you're keeping the laws. The whole thing's going to go to hell. It says so. It will therefore be to our merit before our God and Adonai to observe it faithfully this whole instruction as God has commanded us. And here it says again, Kol hamitzvot hazot, all these commandments. So, again, it does not seem to be just the 10 commandments, but maybe again, the 10 commandments were the basis for covenant, but not the only laws that we're supposed to keep. Now, we're going to finish with this section here from chapter 7. When your God Adonai brings you to the land that you're about to enter and possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations much larger than you, and your God Adonai delivers them to you and you defeat them, you must doom them to destruction and grant them no terms and give them no quarter. You're not supposed to let them survive. You're not supposed to keep them around. They're much more powerful than you, and God is giving them to you to defeat them, and you must destroy them. You shall not intermarry with them, and do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods, and Adonai's anger will blaze forth against you, promptly wiping you out. So here it says again, why? It's not, well, I wonder why it is that God says we're supposed to wipe these people out. I wonder why God says we're not supposed to marry them. It says right here, because they will turn your children away. And again, it's about the next generation. And again, the consequence is right there. So, lest you think that God is bloodthirsty for pagans to be wiped out, it's not what it says. I mean, it does say that, but that's not all it says. It says you will be wiped out. So it is not for the squeamish. It is not as straightforward or as clear that it's just, oh, look, Jews are supposed to kill these people, and that's what God wants us to do. No, God wants us to make sure that we don't have any way of being drawn into the same behavior that got the Canaanites wiped out in the first place. Now, again, this goes against our modern sensibilities, and we don't like to hear this. I get it. I understand. But again, the Canaanites were practicing child sacrifice. This wasn't another kind of faith. This wasn't multiculturalism where we had to make sure that we respected people's different traditions and the different way that they worship God. They were sacrificing little children to their God. It made sense to them. They did it. They didn't do it because they hated their kids. They didn't do it because they didn't think their kids were valuable or they didn't love them, whatever. They did it because they thought that's what their gods wanted them to do. They told people that's what their gods wanted them to do. They said that if we sacrifice our children, God will give us a good harvest. God will protect our other children yet to come. If we sacrifice the first one, all the rest of them will live. That's what they believed. How do you change people's mind on that? How do you stop them from sacrificing their children? That was the only way they could do it. I'm not going to negotiate with them and say, yeah, you can live with us. Just stop killing your kids. It wasn't like that. They didn't think that they were killing their kids. They were offering up sacrifices. It was tempting. It was a logical thing. When over half the kids were dying of infant mortality for things that we can prevent now with a shot, what do? You think that maybe God will, why did I sacrificed my kid, but my next kid still died? Well, because you didn't say the right words. You messed up. You didn't offer it with, you didn't add the goat to the sacrifice. You didn't sacrifice. You know what happens. And we know what happened. The Bible told us what happened. The kings of Judah were offering up their own children to sacrifice right before the temple was destroyed. They were doing it. The Bible says they were doing it. It's not speculative. The Bible says in the book of Kings that these kings were offering up their own children to these gods, to Baal. They didn't wipe it out. So as much as they were supposed to, as much as the Bible says they were supposed to, they didn't do it. Now, it's very possible, Doreen, that this is here because the people, by the time they wrote the book of Deuteronomy, knew they screwed up. And they projected backwards this idea that God told them to wipe them out. Why? Because King Josiah did that. We read about it in the book of Kings. He went around and he wiped out all these people that were sacrificing to these gods. He wiped out all the places where people were doing this, and he tried to stop it. It was too late. By then, it was too late. 20 years after King Josiah dies in battle with the Egyptians, his own sons are taken into captivity. His own son is blinded by King Nebuchadnezzar. His own grandchildren are murdered. It was too late. And he did everything right. King Josiah checked off all the boxes. It was too late. The damage was already done. So it's very possible that the people who wrote this already knew that they had screwed up. How could they have fixed it? By wiping these people out in the first place. They didn't do it. So it also could be written by people who are essentially telling you, you screwed up. You didn't wipe it out. We tried. Some of us tried. But the only way we could have done it is if we had wiped out the Canaanites in the first place. They didn't do it. We know they didn't do it. We know they didn't do it from the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua says they didn't wipe them all out. But by the time of Kings, 500 years later, the consequences were done. Exactly what Josiah does. Instead, this is what you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, and consign their images to fire. For you are a people consecrated to your God Adonai. Of all the peoples on earth, your God Adonai chose you to be God's treasured people. And this is the Am Segulah. This is to be God's treasured people. It is not because you are the most numerous of people that Adonai grew attached to you and chose you. Indeed, you are the smallest of peoples. That's what it says 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. That's what it says. But it is because Adonai favored you and kept the oath made to your fathers, that Adonai freed you with a mighty hand and rescued you from the house of bondage, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that only your God Adonai is God, the steadfast God who keeps the divine covenant faithfully to the 1,000th generation of those who love God and keep the divine commandments, but who instantly requites with destruction those who reject God, never slow with those who reject, but requiting them instantly. Therefore, observe faithfully this instruction. HaMitzvot, v'hachukim, v'hamishpatim, the instructions, the laws, and the rules which I urge you today. Ayom. So that's where we're going to finish off today, because next week, actually, we're going to read what is the next portion of the Torah, the portion Ekev, which is what we read after we read Va'et Hanan, which contains both the 10 Commandments and the Shema. The people who decided where the chapter verses break in the book of Deuteronomy purposely wanted you to read those two chapters together and end with these words: observe faithfully the instruction, the laws, and the rules which I charge you this day. What better way to end is a summary what we read today. which is following the rules, following the instruction, which I command you, Hayam, today. And again, you could say again that this is intergeneration. If you look back here, the 1,000 generation, guess what? You're still within the 1,000 generations. We haven't gone past the 1,000 generations yet. You're still part of the 1,000th generation. Covenant is still on us. And again, you could say 1,000 generations. What? Would it really be? About 100.
That's all. Oh my.
Well, if you think 30 years for a generation, 30 times 100 would be 3,000. I know it seems like it would be more, right? I mean, not that, I mean, I guess, I don't think it's that far, but 1,000 generations is 10 times longer. We're not even a fraction, a little fraction through it, 10th of the way through that. So,
We established Israel.
yeah, but one,
They've done something.
yep. And as I said, how do you end it here? Because the next line, you'll see next week when we start it up. And if you obey these rules and observe them faithfully, your God will maintain you faithfully for the covenant made on oath with your father. The same things that we say. As we said last week, as we said this week, it is we'll say for the weeks as we go through. But every week almost we'll read a phrase or two that you know very well. And actually this next week, we're going to read a phrase which I love, and I actually shared with so as I mentioned to you, Joyce, you weren't here last week, but I said that the reason we didn't have class 2 weeks ago, because I was actually at a church at Valencia United Methodist, teaching a class, one of their night classes. And I talked a little bit about Jewish tradition and specifically when it comes to food, because this was a dinner and learning session. And I talked about a little bit how we use the Birkat Hamazon as a way of kind of establishing our values, the blessing after meals. And some of those lines are from the book of Deuteronomy. But again, what's so special is this line too that we just read. It's not because we're the biggest people, not because there's so many of us, that God chose us, right? We weren't picked because we were so numerous. So when people, lament the fact there aren't a lot of Jews, well, according to this, there never were. And that doesn't mean that what we're doing is any less important. There's actually something special about being a part of the few and the proud, right, John? That's what we are. We're God's Marines. But it is a hefty responsibility. Even you're right, even smaller. We're don't say SEAL team because those aren't Marines, but
But it's interesting though, because history is very fragile 100 years ago. Might not have happened
what do you mean?
when Israel was
Oh yeah. Yeah, but you wonder what did we do to merit that in our lifetime or in the last 100 years? It's pretty special. So we got to live through it. So again, tonight, as we think about Tisha B'Av and think about what we lost, do not forget how lucky we are to be a part of this miracle. And that's why, for those of us who got to go to Israel this last year, why I worked so hard to make sure that everybody had a chance to be there this year to celebrate. I couldn't do much more. I mean, I really, kind of tried to figure out what we could do to celebrate Israel and to think about Israel during the 75th anniversary. There was not a lot that went on in this country. There's not a lot that went on in Israel for the 75th anniversary, but yeah, there were. But I do feel that we had to do something, and going to Israel to me is about the most important thing you can do. Yeah. What about Fauda? The Fauda trip. Yeah, I'll say. I mean, I haven't said anything about it yet, John, because they want me to come up with a date. They actually want me to do it in February, but it is good weather. But what I didn't want to do, I'm not sure. as I told some people, we do have a birthright trip that we're going to do next year that Temple Beth and me is leading, which means that I'm leading. But I'm debating back and forth whether to do the Fauda trip in February or do both trips in June so that I don't have to go back and forth twice again this year. So, or next year, that I would go in June and then I could go once. No, I'll do back to back. No, but it's the Fauda thing would only be like one day.
Oh, come on.
What, you want to do 2 days of Fauda?
I thought it was 2 weeks of time.
Fauda is the show it's on Netflix and JLTV. I want to say it's on tomorrow night, Thursday night. It's a very good show. It's about Israel's counterterrorism activities. It's about the Deuteronomy, there's units of Israeli soldiers that essentially are trained to infiltrate. It's very dangerous. They go into Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza and pretend to be Arabs to gather intelligence. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, I saw it. It's great.
And they speak Arabic fluently. Most of these people are from families that were from Arab speaking countries. Fauda, it's on Netflix and that's on JLTV. If you don't have Netflix, you can watch it on JLTV, but it is a really good show and it is based on true stuff. And some of the actors on it are actually producers and were actually part of the unit in particular.
Yeah.
Did that.
I can tell you, you have a colleague in Israel. There's Israeli Arabs that are the actors, and they all love the show because they don't see themselves as being bad guys. It's really a neat way to bring.
I think it does bring people together. I just hope it brings them together in a way so that they don't want to kill each other, but it is very powerful and it is, it's a very well done show. I think it's very well done. So they have one more season coming out. Yeah. And then I think that's going to be it. I think they're doing 4 seasons, but the same crew did this show called Prisoners of War. And that was only on for 2 seasons. It's also on JLTV on Thursday nights. And Prisoners of War was not the inspiration. It was what Homeland is developed from. So Homeland was the American version of Prisoners of War. It's called Prisoners of War, Khatufim, and they did 2 seasons of it. So we're broadcasting that, and that's never been shown on Netflix. If you want to see, and some people say it's much. I mean, I never watched Homeland, so I can't tell you. But they did 9 seasons of Homeland, and only 2 seasons of Prisoners of War. So you can imagine that it's a little bit different, especially as it goes on. But the first 2, the 2 seasons of Prisoners of War are very good, and especially for people that liked Fauda, it's the same producers, same writers, and people really liked Prisoners of War too. So it's on Thursdays, and again, I think we get to air it for another year on JLTV. So if you have to record it, but it is, if you want to catch up on the episodes, but I think we're running them for a while. I think I just went off. All right, folks. The computer just died.
What about Egypt?
Thanks, Rabbi.